When you think of the world's second largest country, you expect it to have a huge population, but that's not the case with Canada. A country spanning an astounding 9.985 million kilometers square has just a meager population of 38.8 million. That's right, a country almost the same size as the entire continent of Europe makes up only 0.5% of the entire world's population. To put things into perspective, Canada has a population density of 4 people per kilometer square, whereas China, with an area just a little smaller than Canada, has a population density of 152 people per kilometer square. And this is the world's second most populated country. What makes things even more interesting is the weird distribution of the Canadian population. Look at this population density map of Canada. 99% of the population is concentrated near the US border, but it's still pretty widespread towards the north. Now look at where 95% of the Canadian population lives, even closer to the border, just within 160 kilometers of it. Look at the map that shows 75% of the Canadian population. It almost looks like a completely empty map. More than half of the population on this map is located below this line called the fourth parallel. This small corner is home to Canada's major cities: Montreal, Toronto, Quebec, and Ottawa. That means the majority of the mainland is completely empty. The 3 territories, Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, represent only 3% of Canada's population, while making up 40% of its landmass. The remaining 60% is divided into 10 provinces, and among those, Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta account for more than 80% of the Canadian population. So the question is, why is 95% of Canada so empty? Why are most of its resources still untapped? And lastly, what's the reason for this one-of-a-kind distribution? Well, it all started way back when European settlers started accessing parts of North America through the St. Lawrence River. At first, the vessels could only travel up until the Lachine Rapids. This was where Montreal developed. Soon, the Lachine Canal was established, and Canada became part of the most popular and efficient route to North America. The formation of the Lachine Canal had unimaginable significance. Firstly, it granted access to the Great Lakes. Secondly, it connected Canada to the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. This meant that Canada now had the potential to become a trading hub thanks to all the routes, and it did. Toronto and Montreal were 2 major cities to develop during these times, during an era when the sea was the only mode of transportation. Port cities were extremely important. This was because it allowed all major trades to occur and also was the place for major immigrant settlement. But why is this all relevant? Whenever immigrants enter a new country, they prefer to settle in urban areas. This is especially true in the case of Canada, where life in the suburbs or countryside is far more harsh and cold. Plus, the population is always more concentrated around industrial hubs where there are more job opportunities and better quality of life. For instance, if we go back to that population density map, we see that one of the only places where the population seems to move north is in the province of Alberta, where it's especially concentrated around Edmonton. But why? Because most of Canada's oil production happens here. The contribution by Alberta is one of the reasons why Canada is the world's 4th largest producer of oil. Considering all of that, it makes sense as to why this region is so densely populated. Another factor is that the land in this province is extremely arable for agriculture, which is rare to find in Canada, so let me explain why that's the case. Many assume the reason to be the extremely cold temperature of northern Canada. Although Nunavut has an average temperature of -3.5 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, it's not the only reason that's stopping settlement. I mean, today even the Arctic has become habitable, so the temperature, although a factor, is not as determinant as many assume. To realize what I say, you need to understand what a continental shield is, one of Canada's most prominent features. Simply put, it's an area that has had crust development take place over millions of years, and a part of the land where the continental crust becomes exposed. We call the shield in Canada the Canadian Shield, to make things easier to understand. The Canadian Shield itself is shaped like a horseshoe. It extends for nearly 5 million square kilometers, spanning all the way from the USA in the south all the way up to the Arctic archipelago in the north. As a result, this means that this shield makes up nearly 50% of Canada's landmass. But why do rocks and crust explain Canada's population problem? Well, let's talk about that. Firstly, a topography like this makes it impossible to grow crops. This is mainly due to the fact that rocks are deposited very heavily right below the soil. Consequently, the layer of topsoil is very thin and virtually holds no water at all. And when you combine the infertile land with the extreme temperatures of the north, the conditions become highly unfavorable for establishing any kind of farmland. Even thinking about agriculture in these areas is impossible, since this is the backbone of any settlement. Establishing infrastructure and even maintaining it becomes a far-fetched dream without heavy investments. Secondly, rock formations here pose a major threat to establishing infrastructure. That's why calling it unlivable is a wild understatement. Huge rocks jut out hundreds of feet, the terrain is rough and unpredictable, and there are sudden changes in elevation, making development impossible. Let me give you an example. During the construction of the Pacific Railway in 1862, the workers faced the most problems while entering into the parts of the Canadian Shield. They were confronted with vast deposits of granite that even dynamite couldn't blow through. Instead, they resorted to using nitroglycerin bombs, which were incredibly easy to trigger, causing accidental triggers. And rocks weren't the end of it. Local workers called the swamps there muskeg because they were incredibly dangerous. During construction itself, the track was replaced 7 times and 3 locomotives were lost. To make matters worse, there's another unique challenge Canada faces. It's forests. While forests are a topographical limitation, they're equally an economic one. In 2017, it employed nearly 210,000 people and contributed $24.6 billion to its GDP. It would be incredibly difficult to start large-scale deforestation without international and public outcry, since these account for nearly 10% of the entire planet's forested area. Whereas towards the south, the closer we move to the US border, the warmer and nicer the land becomes, all thanks to the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are the biggest factor for the concentration in the Windsor City-Quebec corridor. They have the world's largest freshwater surface area. In fact, they're so big they essentially act like oceans and seas. How so? Water has the ability to store its energy longer than other materials. In this case, the land. So during the summers, when the sun is at its peak, the Great Lakes quickly absorb most of the heat and act like a heat sink. Consequently, this ensures a cool atmosphere around the lake. But it's during the winter that we see their true magic. As the temperature starts to fall, the Great Lakes become warmer than land. Therefore, they start acting like a heat source. They radiate their stored warmth onto the surrounding land. As a result, they create a moderate environment that ensures that plants don't freeze and die. This effect is further amplified by the warm winds coming from Mexico. Together, they provide one of the nicest environments not only to live in, but also mass grow a variety of different crops. And as we saw in our previous example of Alberta, people gravitate towards land where there is agriculture. So near the Great Lakes, we have multiple port cities, a trade route, and a brilliant atmosphere with fertile soil. It's no wonder why more than 50% of Canadians choose to live here. However, the problem of population density in Canada has not gone unnoticed. Former Prime Minister Mackenzie King stated, "If some countries have too much history, we have too much geography." And this makes sense because the topography of Canada is one of its main challenges, as people gather in these specific regions. But having more people doesn't necessarily fix the problem. The larger underlying question is that of capacity. For example, the massive housing shortage Canada is currently facing. While this is fueled by immigration, it is still resulting in cities being overcrowded. Canada needs to build 5.8 million new homes and 2 million rental units by 2030 to have a hope of solving this crisis. Even besides that, when we talk about capacity, it encompasses aspects other than housing alone. Healthcare, transport, education, jobs, all these sectors will see the wear and tear that comes with the population being concentrated in a few named cities alone. But what's the solution? Livio De Matteo is a professor of economics at Lakehead University. According to him, the real challenge and the solution for Canada is to increase the population in such a way that it spreads out. This would in turn lead to several urban centers developing, ultimately causing economic development, and maybe one day the phrase, "why 95% of Canada is empty," will become a thing of the past.